There comes a moment, subtle yet quietly disturbing, when a person begins to sense that something has changed, something they cannot fully identify yet cannot dismiss. For a long period they existed within the ease of your attention. Your focus moved toward them like a steady flow, dependable, consistent, unquestioned. Within that steady presence they formed an unspoken belief that you would always be there. But now something feels different. You have stopped pursuing. When someone who was emotionally involved in giving, chasing, or consistently offering attention suddenly pulls back, it does not just create a gap in communication. It creates a deeper disturbance within the other person's inner world. This occurs because people, especially within emotional dynamics, are not only reacting to visible actions but to patterns of consistency. When attention is given repeatedly, even in quiet ways through care, presence, or emotional openness, it builds an invisible framework in the other person's mind. That framework becomes part of how they regulate their own self-perception. They may never consciously think this person makes me feel important, but psychologically that is exactly what is happening. The act of being pursued becomes a stabilizing mirror, reflecting back a version of themselves that feels valued, desired, or emotionally significant. When that pursuit suddenly disappears, the mirror does not simply fade, it fractures. What follows is not immediate clarity, but confusion. The human mind is deeply wired to seek patterns, and it depends on repetition to feel secure. If someone becomes accustomed to receiving messages, attention, effort, or emotional energy from a specific individual, the brain begins to treat that pattern as expected reality. When that pattern is disrupted, the nervous system reacts as if something is wrong even before the conscious mind can make sense of it. This is why the absence of pursuit often feels more intense than its presence. It does not just remove interaction, it removes certainty. At this point, the unconscious mind begins searching for explanations that protect emotional balance. Rather than immediately accepting that the person has stopped caring or moved on, the psyche often creates softer interpretations. It may assume temporary distance, outside distractions, or a pause that will eventually end. This is a protective mechanism because accepting the full reality of withdrawal would force the ego to face a potential loss of importance. The ego resists this because it threatens the internal story of being valued or prioritized. Yet beneath these justifications, something more subtle begins to grow. The absence of pursuit creates a kind of psychological hunger, not necessarily for the person at first, but for the emotional state their attention once created. This is why the reaction is often indirect or delayed. The person may not immediately reach out, but they begin to think more frequently about the one who stepped back. The attention that once felt ordinary now becomes noticeable precisely because it is gone. In psychological terms, this relates to contrast perception. Something is fully recognized only when its absence creates a clear difference from its prior presence. The emotional system also begins to interpret this shift through the lens of control. When someone is being pursued, whether consciously or not, they may feel they hold a certain level of influence in the dynamic. They can choose when to respond, when to engage, or when to withdraw, while the pursuer remains available. When that pursuit ends, that sense of influence dissolves. Suddenly, the dynamic is no longer centered around them. This creates a quiet internal discomfort because it shifts the balance of psychological power. The mind naturally seeks equilibrium, so it attempts to restore balance either by re-establishing contact or by mentally reducing the importance of what was lost. This is also the stage where projection begins to operate. Instead of fully processing their own emotional reaction, the person may project explanations outward. They might assume the other person is playing games, creating distance on purpose, or testing them. These narratives are not necessarily true, but they serve to protect the ego from acknowledging vulnerability. Because in this context, vulnerability would mean admitting that the absence is affecting them more than expected. As time passes, if the withdrawal continues without interruption, the emotional system begins to adjust. What once blended into the background becomes a signal. The person starts noticing patterns they previously overlooked. Memories become more vivid. Moments that once felt ordinary now carry emotional weight when viewed in retrospect. This happens because the brain reconstructs meaning based on present absence rather than only past presence. At a deeper level, what is occurring is a forced shift from external validation toward internal reflection. As long as attention is consistently present, the mind can remain outwardly focused. But when that attention disappears, it turns inward out of necessity. This inward movement is often uncomfortable because it reveals unresolved emotional dependencies, attachment tendencies, or identity structures built around being desired. This is why the withdrawal of pursuit is rarely experienced as neutral. It is felt as disruption, loss, curiosity, resistance, and sometimes even fixation, all layered together before any real understanding forms. Attention operates as a form of psychological currency because it is not merely interaction. It is a signal of value, recognition, and emotional investment that directly shapes how a person sees themselves. Human identity does not develop in isolation. It is continuously reinforced through feedback loops with others. When someone receives attention, especially consistent and emotionally meaningful attention, the brain interprets it as confirmation of relevance. This may not always enter conscious awareness, but it is deeply embedded in the emotional system. The experience of being noticed, remembered, and prioritized becomes subtly linked with self-worth. When one person offers sustained attention to another, they are essentially providing a form of psychological validation. This validation communicates a message to the receiving mind that says, "You are important enough for me to focus on you." Over time, this message becomes familiar, and familiarity often turns into expectation. The individual receiving attention may not actively think about it, but their nervous system adapts to it as a stable input. It becomes part of their emotional environment, like background conditions that are assumed to remain constant. This is where the idea of currency becomes meaningful. Just as financial currency regulates access to resources and stability, attention regulates access to emotional certainty and validation. When it is present in abundance, it creates a sense of psychological grounding. The individual feels seen, valued, and emotionally secure. But the worth of any currency is only fully recognized when its flow is disrupted. As long as attention remains steady, it is rarely examined or deeply appreciated. It simply becomes part of the normal experience. However, when attention is withdrawn, even slightly, the system that relied on it begins to register a deficiency. This deficiency is not purely emotional in a simple sense, it is structural. It influences how the person organizes their internal sense of importance. The absence of attention creates a space where validation once existed, and the mind feels compelled to respond to that space. This response may not immediately appear as a clear longing for the person who withdrew, but it often shows up as a general uneasiness or increased mental focus on that individual. On a deeper level, attention also acts as a mirror. When someone pays attention to you, they reflect you back to yourself through their reactions, engagement, and presence. This reflection helps stabilize identity because it reinforces a consistent image of who you are in relation to others. Without that mirror, identity becomes less externally confirmed, and the mind begins searching for alternative sources of reflection or meaning. This is why the withdrawal of attention can feel unsettling even if the person does not consciously recognize emotional attachment. Dependence on attention does not automatically imply weakness or insecurity. It is a natural result of how the human mind is structured. People are designed to read signals from others to understand their place in relationships, social structures, and emotional connections. Attention is one of the clearest signals used in this process. When it is given consistently, it quietly communicates importance to the receiver. The mind registers this pattern and gradually weaves it into its internal sense of self-worth and emotional safety in relationships. Over time, this can form a subtle, unconscious cycle where attention is not only appreciated, but quietly anticipated. That anticipation itself gains strength. Even when the person is not actively receiving attention in a particular moment, the expectation of it continues to influence their emotional baseline in the background. That is why when attention is suddenly reduced or taken away, it does not feel like a simple gap. It feels as if something essential is missing, something that should naturally be present, even when the conscious mind cannot clearly define what that missing piece is. This also sheds light on why attention can become habit-forming in quiet ways, not necessarily as dependence on a single individual, but as a reinforcement of identity through outside validation. Every message, every interaction, every signal of interest strengthens a loop that says, "You matter in this space." When that loop is active, the mind experiences a form of emotional reward. When it is interrupted, the reward system detects a drop, which can trigger overthinking, curiosity, or an urge to re-establish that connection. In relationship dynamics, this is why attention often holds more influence than obvious actions. It is not only about what is done, but about what is consistently directed toward a person's awareness. Focus itself becomes the offering, and when that focus is withdrawn, it does not just leave quiet behind. It initiates a psychological adjustment process where the mind has to reconsider what holds importance and where that importance now exists. The ego responds before deeper awareness has time to arise, because the ego is the first layer of the mind that encounters disruption in emotional or relational patterns. It is structured to preserve stability, continuity of identity, and a sense of control within one's social and emotional world. When something unexpected occurs, especially a change in how someone behaves toward us, the ego does not stop to explore deeper meaning. It reacts instantly to defend the internal image of self it has been building over time. When a person is regularly pursued or emotionally engaged with, even without conscious acknowledgement, a certain balance forms. That balance includes assumptions about availability, importance, and position within the relationship. The ego begins to organize these assumptions into a stable inner storyline, such as "this person cares," "this person will reply," or "I hold a certain level of influence here." These stories are not always expressed in words, yet they exist as a felt sense of certainty. The mind depends on them to reduce uncertainty in connections. When the pursuit suddenly stops, that balance is disrupted. The ego experiences this disruption not as an abstract shift, but as a direct threat to its established structure. It does not yet question whether the change might be healthy or meaningful. Instead, it immediately senses a loss of control and possibly a loss of significance. This is why the initial reaction is almost always defensive rather than thoughtful. The ego's priority is not truth, but the preservation of a consistent identity. This preservation can appear in different forms. One of the earliest is denial. The ego may try to reinterpret the situation in a way that avoids immediate emotional discomfort. It might assume the change is temporary, accidental, or unrelated to itself. This allows the inner system to avoid confronting the possibility of being deprioritized or no longer receiving the same level of attention. Denial works as a cushion between reality and emotional impact, giving the mind space to adjust without collapsing its existing self-story. If denial does not hold, the ego often shifts into rationalization. It starts building explanations that protect dignity and maintain a sense of control. For instance, it may interpret the withdrawal as intentional, strategic, or even manipulative. This reframing allows the individual to maintain a sense of psychological balance rather than fully facing vulnerability. Rationalization is less about accuracy and more about emotional defense. It transforms uncertainty into something that feels easier to manage. Another common response from the ego is an attempt to reassert control. This can show up as sudden efforts to reconnect, test limits, or provoke a reaction from the person who has withdrawn. These behaviors are not always deliberate strategies. Often they are impulsive reactions driven by discomfort with losing influence. The ego tries to restore the previous dynamic because it is familiar, and familiarity is interpreted as safety. Even if that dynamic was not deeply fulfilling, it was predictable, and predictability reduces internal tension. At the same time, there is often a resistance to appearing affected. The ego is highly concerned with perception, both how it is seen by others and how it views itself. So alongside attempts to regain control, there may also be outward displays of indifference. This creates an inner conflict where the person feels unsettled internally but presents themselves as unaffected externally. This split is a clear sign of ego-driven reaction, where managing appearance becomes just as important as processing emotions. What makes the ego's reaction particularly strong is its speed. It operates faster than reflective awareness. Before a person has the chance to analyze their emotions, interpret the situation, or consider deeper meaning, the ego has already produced a response aimed at reducing discomfort. This is why early reactions in situations of emotional withdrawal often seem inconsistent or confusing. A person may shift between reaching out and pulling back, between curiosity and pride, because different ego defenses activate at different moments. Only after this initial surge does awareness begin to surface. Awareness moves more slowly, with greater reflection, and has the ability to hold complexity. It can consider that the withdrawal might reveal attachment patterns, emotional reliance, or imbalance in the relationship. But by the time awareness arrives, the ego has already shaped the first emotional and behavioral responses. This sequence matters because it explains why people often do not immediately act in alignment with their deeper understanding. The ego reacts to protect identity, while awareness arrives later to interpret meaning. In the space between these two processes, confusion, contradiction, and emotional turbulence naturally arise as the mind shifts from automatic defense to conscious reflection. Silence then begins to act like a mirror. When external interaction is removed, what remains is not emptiness, but the mind's unfiltered reflection of itself projected into that absence. During normal interaction, attention, words, replies, and emotional signals provide a steady stream of external structure. They give the mind something tangible to respond to, interpret, and regulate itself through. But when that stream suddenly stops, the mind does not simply experience nothing. It begins to interpret that nothing, and in doing so, it reveals what was always present beneath the surface. When someone is emotionally engaged with another person, especially in a dynamic where attention, pursuit, or validation has been part of the pattern, the silence that follows does not stay neutral. It becomes a charged space. The absence of communication forces the inner world to create meaning without external confirmation. And the human mind is not comfortable with a lack of meaning. It constantly tries to construct a narrative even when no new information is available. So in the absence of words, actions, or signals, the mind turns inward and starts using memory, fear, desire, and insecurity to fill that space. This is where silence becomes reflective. The person who has stopped reaching out is no longer shaping perception through new behavior. Instead, the other individual is left alone with their internal impressions of the relationship. And those impressions begin to surface more intensely. Things that were once overlooked or minimized can now rise into awareness because there is no fresh emotional input to distract from them. The silence removes external noise, allowing internal content to become clearer. In many situations, what emerges in that silence is not just thoughts about the other person, but reflections about the self in relation to them. The mind begins to ask subtle questions such as why the change feels uncomfortable, why the attention is missed, or why the absence feels so noticeable. These are not purely logical questions. They are emotional reflections that point toward attachment, expectation, and psychological reliance that may not have been consciously recognized before the withdrawal occurred. Silence also intensifies projection. When there is no clear information, the mind fills the uncertainty with its own interpretations. These interpretations are rarely neutral. They are shaped by personal fears, desires, and past experiences. If someone carries a fear of rejection, silence may be experienced as abandonment. If someone has a strong need for control, silence may feel like a challenge or a form of manipulation. If there is unresolved emotional attachment, silence may be interpreted as a hidden sign of continued connection. In each case, the silence itself does not contain meaning. It reflects back the meaning that already exists within the observer. This is why silence can feel so psychologically intense. It is not merely the absence of communication. It activates internal material that was previously stabilized by ongoing interaction. When the external structure disappears, the internal structure becomes more visible. Thoughts that were once organized around real-time engagement become repetitive, looping, and amplified. The mind revisits past moments, replays conversations, and searches for hidden meanings, not because new information exists, but because the nervous system is trying to restore a sense of certainty. There is also a deeper effect at the level of identity. When someone consistently receives attention or emotional engagement, even in small amounts, it contributes to their sense of relational position. They may not consciously define themselves through it, but it subtly reinforces the idea that they are someone who is noticed by this person. When silence replaces that engagement, the identity anchored in that reflection begins to feel unstable. The individual is no longer receiving confirmation of their place in the other person's awareness, and so they begin to question not only the other person's feelings, but also their own significance within that connection. Over time, silence pushes a person to confront internal emotional material that was previously distributed across interaction. In active communication, emotional tension is often shared between two people through exchange. In silence, all of that tension becomes internalized by the one who is left reflecting. This creates intensity because there is no longer an external outlet for emotional regulation. The mind has to process everything internally without feedback or closure. Because of this, silence does not remain empty. It turns into a surface onto which unresolved emotions, assumptions, and fears are projected. It becomes a space where imagination replaces certainty, where memory replaces present interaction, and where inner truth starts to emerge without the stabilizing effect of an external response.